So the way this is going to go is Karin's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then Amanda Focke is going to speak about the archives and how to access them, and then Anna Shparberg is going to talk, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A for the last half hour. So we'll have about a half hour to have a conversation about what the archival process has been and what this new gift is about. Last year, I'll just say, last year when we did this conference for the first time, it was very much around the donors, and we had the major donors all speak. This gift from the John E. Mack Institute is new. It's by far the largest and the most significant gift that we've probably received since the original Jacques Vallée collection, I would say. And so we have a lot to talk about here. So let me hand it over to Karin Austin, the director of the John E. Mack Institute, and I think she's going to read her talk.
I am.
She's going to follow my bad example and read.
Yeah.
No, it's a good example. I'm just joking. And go ahead.
I was very jealous of Greg yesterday, who just, hi Greg. You embodied the space up here as if it was, like breathing to you, and I'm not nearly that talented, so I am going to, in order to be efficient and cover everything that I would like to cover today, I am going to read. I'll look up a few times to make sure you guys aren't asleep, but once I'm finished, then I'll have a chance to relax, and we'll have a discussion here. So that being said, it's been a long time since I've been up in front of a bunch of people. My inner introvert is wrestling with the other part of me that's completely okay with this, so just bear with me while I catch my breath and get my balance in it. It won't take too long, I don't think. A couple of notes in advance, because I say these things a lot in the talk. The first thing is about John. So many of you would maybe know John as Dr. Mack, but if you had known him in life, he never introduced himself as Dr. Mack. He was always John, and he was John to me, John to his friends, John to his colleagues. So when I speak about him here today, I do so with affection and with his first name. The other thing you'll hear me say is Jemmy, and Jemmy is a really convenient way to shorten the John E. Mack Institute. So I'm not saying Jimmy like Jimmy the boy next door, Jemmy as in Jemmy. So with that, I take a breath and exhale and say I'd like to have to start today with my deepest and most sincere gratitude for all of the people who have in some way contributed to the scanning, processing, and disposition of John's archives. Everyone involved has been so utterly and absolutely essential to the success of this project that I would be remiss to stand here without first invoking the village of kind, smart, dedicated, inspired, funny, thank God, and crazy, crazy generous volunteers who are each and every one responsible for getting John's archives and me safely to Rice. I could spend 5 minutes raving or more, raving about each one of these folks, but in the interest of time, I'm mostly just going to mention their names. Please imagine all of them to be on the stage with me this afternoon. Indeed, some of them even are. And knowing that their contributions have been absolutely essential to the success of this endeavor, and that I am here because of them. I want to acknowledge first Will Boucher and Danny Mack, because they have together been holding down the fort at Jemmy and safeguarding John's materials for nearly 2 decades now. Without either of them, this donation wouldn't have happened at all. And I also acknowledge Jeff and Amanda Focke, the head of special collections here at Rice University. I am deeply appreciative for their ongoing care and total dedication to this endeavor. They are as essential to its success as are Will and Danny. And they are in good company with the other rock stars who have been, again, incredibly generous with their time, talents, money, and various resources. The rock stars I have in mind are Mark Curate, Ann Tyler, Karen Young, Heather Hawley, Brian Lee, Maya Christabel, Mike Chalers and his good friend, God bless her, I can't remember her name right now, she came for a day, and Lisa Stemler, Tony Mack, and the movers who loaded the truck for us in Maine. We could have not gotten that task done without them. The archivists and the librarians who helped us offload the U-Haul here at Rice at the end of a very long, sweaty workday. And of course, I would also like to thank my loving husband who, while missing me very much, is infinitely patient and respectful of my irrepressible need and unwavering commitment to do this work. My deepest and most heartfelt thanks to you all. I'm already teary. I have tissues. I think I'm going to need. I knew this was coming. So, and with that said, I'd like to take a brief side excursion that I was not planning on and spend a few minutes responding to your question yesterday, Greg, that was about why would experiencers seek out John? The answer to that question is entirely relevant to this conference and the critical necessity for John's archives of the Impossible Library. Experiencers sought out John not because he was a psychiatrist, but because he was a Harvard scholar in a class of one by himself. I personally didn't start with John. I started with NASA. And when NASA couldn't help me, I tried to find a government agency that handled such things. There wasn't one. So the next reasonable and respectable association that existed that I could track down was MUFON. I attended one MUFON meeting hoping that I might find some help and ended up leaving within the first 15 minutes as it was full of a bunch of retirees who were only interested in the nuts and bolts of the phenomenon. From there, I tried local assistance. I sourced a hypnotherapist in the Yellow Pages who told me he could help me lose weight or quit smoking. I needed neither of those things at the time. And he could definitely help me get rid of the space aliens. Obviously, I took a hard pass on that option and looked for the most open-minded therapist I could find. I set an appointment with her, and after her 15 minutes of speaking with me, she diagnosed my problem as temporary psychosis and prescribed some antipsychotic meds for me to take. Of course, I promptly threw the script into the trash on my way out the door. So where does one go after that when beings that don't belong to this space-time are suddenly appearing in one's home in the middle of the night? At the time, there was almost no other known or notable researchers in the US during the early to mid-90s. David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, and John Mack were the three biggies. I think Barbara Lamb and Kathleen Martin were probably doing their work then, but I certainly didn't know of them and wasn't aware of any of the research they were doing. Of course, Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, was a confirmation for many of us that we weren't alone in what had happened to us. But that was it. There was no one else. As someone who was inclined to work within the strictures of science and to work with someone who was a reputable, intelligent, and not inclined to immediately psychopathologize me, where would I go? There was quite literally only one person. Again, John was in a class all by himself. And I wanted to also say, Greg, that John didn't start with a transformational approach to the phenomenon. He entered the field assuming he was going to identify some kind of psychopathology in the people he met from Bud Hopkins' community of experiencers. And of course, most of us know the story from there. That's not at all what happened. John found himself face to face with something truthful, and for him, personally paradigm shifting. Regarding John's orientation toward transformation, for those who don't know, in session, John was exceptional at holding space for experiencers in a way that would allow us to move through the trauma and ontological shock, which of course was very often part and parcel of the abduction experience. He created a safe space of non-judgment and curious inquiry, which allowed experiencers to say out loud all of the really weird and oftentimes terrifying events that occurred during the start of an abduction encounter. That our relationship, that the experiencer's relationship to the phenomenon and our understanding of what was happening to us evolved over the course of time was in very large part due to the information that was being conveyed to experiencers by the beings during our interactions with them. In other words, the phenomenon itself set the tone for the narrative, not John. John's experience as a clinician and a trauma specialist turned out to be uniquely and appropriately helpful under the circumstances, but most of us didn't seek him out because he was a clinician. Again, we sought him out because he was the most highly credible and pedigreed researcher investigating the phenomenon who wouldn't instantly write off or pathologize us for the high strangeness of what we were experiencing. In reality, John should have been doing his research in collaboration with an interdisciplinary team of physicists, astronomers, anthropologists, and philosophers, but academics didn't want to touch it. And indeed, scholars still have to participate in this research from the safety of invisible colleges, lest they lose their jobs or the possibility of achieving tenure. That is why Jeff's Archives of the Impossible is so essential to humankind's investigation of this phenomenon. Without it, scholars and researchers would not have access to the very important paradigm-shifting data contained within thousands and thousands of files that can now be found here at Rice University. And on that note, we return to our regularly scheduled program. I feel like I could just end there. Thank you. Yeah, go for it. Thank you. I'm going to have a swig of water because I'm, of course, thirsty now. He's a lovely fellow, isn't he? He's so handsome, such a kind face. That really just shows, I think, I love this picture of him. That's his warmth and kind eyes are just right there. I really, really miss him. And I know a lot of other people in the community do as well. Anyway, having said that, for weeks I wondered how I should begin a talk about donating John's materials to Archives of the Impossible. As you can imagine, it's an intimidating assignment. I feel an enormous sense of responsibility to get this right, not just to communicate effectively or passionately about John and his archives, but to set a tone for future research into the phenomenon because of the potential it holds for evolving humankind's understanding of the universe in which we live. After spending some time noodling on the challenge, it occurred to me there's a story here, one that in many ways already belongs to the world, and yet for me, it's also a very personal one. The threads of the story extend backwards in time. They are stitched into this present moment through the narratives of thousands of people who experienced extraordinary events that were so anomalous, so ontologically challenging, their lives were forever changed by them. In working with this population of individuals, John discovered that even though experiencers often metabolize the meaning and impact of their encounters in differing ways, they were, on the whole, highly credible people, usually perfect strangers from all walks of life, whose entirely unbelievable reports of alien abduction shared in common strikingly consistent recurrent themes. John would point to each of these characteristics in interviews when asked why he believed witnesses who took part in his research. He was also quick to add that in his 40 years as a clinician, nothing had ever prepared him for the emotional power expressed by experiencers in their sessions with him. That the experiencers were also appropriately skeptical about our own encounters further persuaded him that some kind of authentic experience was occurring, even if the construct of reality it alluded to seemed impossible. In fact, experiencer reports of physical contact with an exotic form of advanced intelligent life turned out to be so utterly compelling for John that he would ultimately push into the center of the table nearly all of the cultural currency he had accumulated through decades of elite intellectual and clinical work within the Harvard and Cambridge hospital ecosystems. In other words, John had everything to lose in advocating for the abduction phenomenon's veracity. Of course, one might argue that if ever a person was going to cash in their chips, it's hard to imagine a more profound reason for doing so. In the wake of Harvard's inquiry, John emerged from the unprecedented investigation with his tenure intact. Nonetheless, he was written off by a number of his academic peers as having lost it. Tongues clicked and heads shook in disbelief as John's intellectual courage was conflated with an irrational unwillingness to reframe the ontology of experiencer narratives as an unidentified psychopathology. One of his colleagues went so far as to suggest that John had gotten into trouble because rather than identifying a new psychiatric disorder, he had called into question the dogma of our dominant Western worldview. In the end, it was John's understanding of reality, it was John's assertion that the phenomenon seemed to be hinting that humankind's understanding of reality might be incomplete, which turned out to be most problematic and perhaps ultimately most prescient. As many of you know, on September 27th, 2004, John died in the middle of the night. Give me a sec. After being hit by a drunk driver. when he was walking across the street in a London suburb. That fateful event broke my heart, along with the hearts of many, many people who loved him all around the world. As much as John loved them, and as much as I loved him. What some of you may not know is that at the time, I was living in John's Cambridge, Massachusetts home while working for him as a personal assistant. The origin story of how I came to live and work at Brattle Street bears mentioning here, as it has everything to do with why I'm standing in this room with you now. In spring of 2003, I had just returned to the States from an overseas move to London, where I lived for 6 months while trying to legally and ultimately unsuccessfully establish residency there. As something of an orphan, I was staying with a friend in Boston while trying to figure out the next steps of my life. After my first few weeks back, John's then partner, Dominique, invited me to house sit for her while she was away on an extended business trip in Africa. Upon her return home, I was actively job hunting for a management position in the fitness industry, of all things, and was still in need of a new place to live. Dom was kind enough to let me stay with her temporarily while I figured things out. One afternoon, she returned home from having had a conversation with John. She explained that he'd been living alone in a very big house with a number of extra guest rooms, and that she had proposed to him the idea of my staying there while I continued to recalibrate my life. It was certainly a solution that never would have occurred to me. Indeed, I had no idea where John lived, but it was a lifeline that I needed at the time. After speaking with John about the arrangement, both of us, having expressed curiosity and concerns about whether or not the situation would be a good fit for us, we decided to give it a go on a trial basis. Needless to say, as housemates, we clicked. Our friendship deepened, and as I had time on my hands during that period of transition in my life, I helped out around the house and ran errands for John as needed. Because he had so many visitors who stayed in his home and he was constantly traveling, there was plenty of work to do. Fairly quickly, it was clear to both of us that he benefited from the added support. So while I continued my hunt for a full-time gig, John formalized my role into a paid position as his personal assistant. It was in that capacity, and as his friend, that I drove him to the airport on September 22nd, 2004. As I pulled into the curb in front of International Departures, John got out of the car and walked to the trunk to pull out his suitcase. After he closed it and stepped onto the sidewalk, he looked at me and asked if I was planning to park the car and meet him inside, as he was hours early for his transatlantic flight. I was caught off guard by the invitation. We hadn't previously discussed it, and with traffic congesting all around me and a policeman ushering me away, I said, "No, I should go. I'll meet you inside the arrivals terminal when you get back." I promise you the whole speech isn't going to be like this. I'm getting through this is the hardest part here. It's smoother sailing after this. I waved goodbye to him and then watched as he draped his coat over his arm and grabbed the handle of his suitcase. He looked at me one last time, said goodbye, and then turned around and walked through the sliding doors that swished open as he approached. When they closed behind him, I had no idea that I would be the last person from John's community to see him alive in the US. In the days and weeks following John's unexpected departure from this mortal coil, I learned two things about death. One, much to my surprise, mixed in with all of the overwhelming grief from the traumatic loss of a beloved friend, was an enormous rush of love. For me, it came in wave after wave during moments of solitude, while sitting on the sofa in John's library at home, where I suddenly found myself living all alone. It came through the kindness and compassion of John's friends, family, and community members during various gatherings of remembrance for the man and the deeply impactful life he had led. I was surprised by all of it. I had imagined that anything having to do with death was bleak and dark and sad. Instead, I learned that it can have everything to do with life and light and love. Needless to say, John's departure was, for me at least, a mind-altering, consciousness-expanding experience that completely changed my understanding of what death can mean to those who remain alive. The second thing I learned about death is that in the most practical sense, it is a matter of business. Immediately following the passing of someone whose life was as culturally impactful as John's comes the administration of that transition. There are practical decisions that have to be made on every level, and an execution of the deceased estate is fairly quickly set in motion, even though the process itself may take some time. Because I was living in John's home and had been serving in the capacity of his personal assistant, it didn't take long for it to become apparent that I had a role to serve in supporting his family with some of these matters, including preparing his home for sale. It is here that my relationship to John's archives began. With the support of John's eldest son, Danny Mack, it took about 8 months to complete all of the administration and prep work that needed to be done at and on behalf of John's Brattle Street property. One of the more tedious responsibilities that I took on at the time was a transfer into sturdy banker's boxes all of John's archive files that had been resting in numerous metal filing cabinets located in his basement. I took the time and care to make sure the files remained in order as John had categorized them and that their boxes were labeled accordingly. At John's Beacon Street office, Will Boucher, John's admin at the Center for Psychology and Social Change, and Pat Carr, John's longtime executive admin at Harvard, were meticulous in transferring his clinical and organizational files into the same type of boxes I use for his files at home. In the end, John's family moved just over 300 boxes of archival materials into a climate-controlled commercial document storage facility where they remained virtually untouched until they were removed for digitization in January of this year. Here enters Jeff Kripal in Archives of the Impossible. Though I should probably backtrack for a moment to stitch in another few threads to this rich archival tapestry. In March 2020, as the US went into COVID lockdown, I found myself abruptly shuttering a boutique home renovation business that I had spent a decade of 80-hour work weeks exhausting every last ounce of my energy to establish and grow. The decision to walk away from the just burgeoning fruit of all that relentless hard labor was a difficult, painful one, to say the least. And yet somehow, as the streets of downtown Chicago turned eerily empty, I realized that I had extracted from my experience of the past 10 years everything that all of my successes and plenty of failures had to offer. What this fateful pandemic held in store for me, I hadn't a clue, but it turned out the path ahead was full of surprises. A few were very sad, and others marked exciting new beginnings I was ready to embrace. While quietly reconnecting with the experiencer community during the first year of lockdown, I found myself behind the scenes suddenly cracked open and receptive to a number of meditative downloads that made clear to me I would not be returning to the profession I had just walked away from. Rather, I understood there was work to be done in the world that built upon the foundation John had created in collaboration with numerous elite intellectuals, academics, clinicians, and support staff, all of whom had helped him fulfill the mission statements of a nonprofit organization that had in various iterations existed since its inception in 1982. Moved by this inspiration and with the help of a sharp editorial team, I wrote up a proposal to reanimate the John E. Mack Institute. Upon its completion, I presented it to GEMI's chair of the board, Danny Mack, for his consideration and approval. I was pleased and very grateful when he greenlit the project. I'm going to give you one more piece of personal information because it's relevant, and then I promise you, we're going to roll up the sleeves and get into archive stuff. In the middle of this massive life redirection, I married my first love, a Norwegian national who lives in the Arctic Circle at the 69th degree parallel, right beneath where the brightest and most breathtaking northern lights manifest on an almost nightly basis. There's a whole long, twisty story of the exhausting and maddening year-long process we went through to marry each other in the middle of a global pandemic. This is not the time or place to tell it. Suffice it to say, we finally pulled it off in Reykjavik, Iceland on September 2nd, 2021. Following our civil ceremony of two in front of an Icelandic judge, I flew back home, packed what little remained of my worldly belongings, and moved to northern Norway to be with my husband. It was from Norway that I rolled up my sleeves and got to work with Danny and Will. As the three of us undertook some of the outstanding housekeeping tasks that needed to be addressed, Danny forwarded to me an email from a professor named Jeff Kripal, who had reached out to him 2 years earlier regarding the disposition of his father's archives, or at least regarding the collection that was specifically connected to John's research into the phenomenon. I immediately followed up with Jeff on Danny's behalf. It was on a very long-distance Zoom call that I was introduced to Jeff and Amanda for the first time. I immediately liked them both. What's not to like? And was surprised to discover how much I resonated with Jeff's intention for Archives of the Impossible. And so began a months-long dialogue between Danny, Will, Jeff, Amanda, myself, and Carolyn Hayes, an acquisitions archivist in the Countway Library at Harvard Medical School. It was a friendly but weighty discussion. The decision on how best to handle the disposition of John's archives was not taken lightly by any of us. Everyone involved wanted to do the right thing for all the right reasons. But parsing out what qualified as the right thing or the right reasons was a matter of great consideration. For Harvard's part, it was clear they had either assumed or hoped that the Countway Library at Harvard Medical School would be receiving all of John's materials. And while there was an obvious logic about the fit of that solution, a number of Harvard's conditions were problematic. First of all, Harvard, as a matter of practice, immediately assumes the copyrights for all of the archival donations it receives. Secondly, the institution also reserves the right to effectively bury any items that it wants to at its singular discretion. Shocker. And while Carolyn assured us that Harvard would openly welcome inquiries into John's archives, and she was genuine about that, she's lovely. I want to underscore that. She was an important member of this team. Well, she assured us that John's archives would be made available as requested. The risk of losing control over files related to the Harvard investigation and or John's research into the phenomenon was unacceptable. Further, even if these stipulations hadn't been of concern, the truth of the matter was, given Harvard's negative response to John's work with experiencers and his writings about their contact encounters, it was clear that Harvard was not a suitable home for John's collection of experiencer tapes, transcripts, letters, and unpublished related research. Alternately, after numerous conversations with Jeff and Amanda, it was equally clear that Archives of the Impossible was, in fact, the perfect home for John's materials. And I'm still going. If anyone needs a bio break, let me know. In contrast to Harvard's policies, not only did Archives of the Impossible allow the Mack family to retain copyrights, but Jeff and Amanda actually expressed an interest in helping to facilitate research of the very materials Harvard found most disconcerting. Once these distinctions between the two institutions were clarified, making the decision to divide John's materials between Harvard and Rice along a pre- and post-pandemic line, excuse me, sorry, I just lost my place here, was fairly obvious. The decision was an obvious one. With all of us, including Carolyn from Harvard, believe it or not, in agreement about this approach, there was one last obstacle standing in the way of the archive's disposition: the problem of how to most effectively preserve for posterity and make accessible for future research the physical archives themselves. Without the materials being digitized in advance of donation due to budget and human resource constraints, both collections would have gone to their respective universities and been promptly placed into storage for an unknown period of time. For Harvard, it would have been years. This would have immediately limited remote accessibility to the archives for both researchers and the general public alike. Not to mention that in bifurcating the materials without a digital copy of the full collection, we would have created a fundamental tear in the connective tissue of John's life work, and none of us wanted that. So we negotiated into the two agreements a stipulation that Jemmy and the Mack family would provide a digitized copy of each collection that would track with the physical materials. This decision made sense for so many reasons. It also created a new problem to solve: the digitization of hundreds of boxes of files that each contain anywhere from 500 to 2,000 discrete pieces of paper that each needed to be hand-fed into a scanner. To frame this as an enormous undertaking only begins to hint at the amount of work involved. To Will's credit, he had spent countless unpaid hours over the years voluntarily scanning some of the most obviously important materials, but the lion's share of John's archives remained without a digital backup. As someone who had professionally spent the past decade honing a project management skill set in high-stakes construction projects, I was not intimidated by the scale of the task. It seemed to me a fairly straightforward brief. identify a location to process the files, source the volunteers to make it happen, transfer the boxes from storage to the processing location, set up the tech, scan the documents, and disperse them. Having not ever been involved with any kind of archiving project, much less a large-scale one, I thought to myself, given the rigors of my professional background, how hard could it be? Heh. I think there's a reason that life keeps most of our challenging experiences a mystery until we're right in the middle of them. So full of unbridled confidence in my ability to fulfill this mission with the right team, resources, and funding, I booked a round trip ticket to Boston with plans to leave on New Year's Eve and return to Norway on January 28th of this year. That I am physically standing in front of you now, instead of sitting home beside my husband with a cozy fire burning in the living room stove, because, you know, it's still quite chilly in the Arctic Circle, should tell you that things didn't quite unfold as I imagined they could or would. And I'll share with you the short version of events. In planning my approach to the scanning project, I allocated the first week for tech setup and transferring the entire lot of boxes to our Airbnb's empty two-car garage. I anticipated we would need about 2 weeks to complete the scanning with a rotating team of six people working from first thing in the morning until late at night. I intended to spend the last week of my trip dispersing the boxes to their final destinations. Again, I thought, with a good system in place, how hard could it be to scan a bunch of documents? Turns out it's not hard to scan documents with zippy modern scanners. It's actually pretty easy. But as archivists everywhere shake their heads and rightfully laugh at my archiving naivete, our digital project had one very analog problem: staples. No matter what staple removing tool is used, and we had at least 3 different kinds, the act of pulling out what are sometimes very old and flimsy papers from a file folder to set them down and position them on a tabletop in just such a way that the page doesn't tear when the staple is removed only goes so fast. And by that I mean it doesn't go fast at all. It's actually a painstaking grinding process that takes a lot of time. To put it another way, if staple removing was an animal, it would be a turtle or a sloth. And the only way my timeline was going to work was if I could get the entire process to move with the efficiency and speed of a cheetah. At this point, I suspect it won't come as a surprise when I tell you that somewhere toward the end of the second week, with the end nowhere in sight, I realized, Houston, we have a problem. Fast forward to the punchline, the very painful punchline. With the help of some superhuman volunteers and by extending my stay in the US for an additional month, our crackerjack team of dedicated workers was able to complete just under 2/3 of the task before the clock ran out again. Somewhere around the 3rd week in February, I called my husband and had a conversation with him that was hard for both of us. I let him know I couldn't come home until the project was done, and that best I could tell, I'd probably need to be in the States for at least another couple of months. Because we had emptied Jemmy's coffers and then some to accomplish as much as we did, and because our Airbnb turned into a pumpkin on February 26th, I had to pivot, and fast. So flying entirely by the seat of my pants at that point, in collaboration with Will and Danny and other scanning team members, I reached out to Jeff and Amanda and worked out a plan to drive the boxes destined for Rice University down to Houston in a 15-foot U-Haul with one of our volunteers and Ubermensch, Karen Young, in the driver's seat. On the morning of our departure from Boston, Karen and I had to throw salt on the driveway in order to clear it of ice from the previous night's snowfall. As we pulled into Rice University 5 days later to unload approximately 150 boxes, we were sweltering alongside Amanda and a spirited team of librarians in the 80-something degree heat and humidity of Houston, Texas. Talk about a cultural whiplash. The next morning, while standing in the living room of an Airbnb that has now become my home away from home, a warm shockwave moved through my body as it suddenly occurred to me that my life had just changed and I hadn't seen it coming. As someone who was accustomed to initiating my own major shifts in life direction, thank you very much, I was completely unprepared for what felt in the moment like a very hard right turn. Slightly confused that I hadn't received some kind of memo from the universe, because the universe is great at sending us memos for things, right? I nonetheless understood that I was right where I was supposed to be, and that I wouldn't have to wait long before all would be revealed. And indeed, that turned out to be true. Almost immediately, Jeff and I began to meet with each other on a near weekly basis, and it soon became apparent to both of us that Jemmy and Archives of the Impossible had some important work to do together. Through numerous dialogues and a quick deep dive into some of Jeff's most recent writings, something else became clear to me as well. Jeff's thinking about the phenomenon almost exactly picked up where John's had left off. So much so that during one of my conversations with Jeff, a simple but powerful image appeared in my mind's eye. From my left, I saw John walk into my field of vision. Jeff was off to my right with his back towards John. His head was turned, and his arm extended behind him as if they were preparing for a relay handoff. As John passed in front of me with his arm outstretched, I looked down and noticed a baton just as he firmly placed it into Jeff's hand. Without hesitation, Jeff locked his fingers around it and walked forward into the future as John disappeared in a cloud of fog. I have another one. I thought 3 would be enough. I might be running out here. Without hesitation, the vision was fleeting, but its impact landed. After a few weeks of exploring Jeff's resonance with Jemmy's renewed mission, it became obvious that for a number of reasons, he was the scholar best suited to step into the very empty shoes that John had left behind. I was a bit shy about it, but I finally plucked up the courage to ask Jeff if he would be willing to help Jemmy pick up where John's research left off. And so, it is my great pleasure to announce here today that he said yes. So hear ye, Dr. Jeff Kripal. Dr. Jeff assumes his new role as a co-director of Jemmy alongside Maya Cristobal, our other director. As you all know Jeff, I'll just say about Maya that she's a Harvard-trained thought leader and psychotherapist. Maya is a pioneer in bioenergetic trauma release and brings with her 40 years of professional experience as a therapist, communications expert, writer, and award-winning screenwriter. Maya, would you stand up and say hi to everybody? She and Jeff are the wise tribal elders of Jemmy right now. I would also like to introduce, as some of you know, our other recent get, as Hollywood likes to say, Darren, Exo-Academian King, who is our new communications director. Darren. I had a moment on Darren. I had no idea who Darren was until Karen Young got me in the U-Haul, and we had nothing but days to listen to podcasts. And I was utterly impressed and pleased and warmed by how articulate you are in communicating about the phenomenon. You're very grounded, intelligent, and thoughtful. And I knew immediately in hearing him I had to find out who that guy was and see if I could bring him over to this side. And I was very pleased after some weeks of getting to know each other that he agreed to take this role on. So we have a crackerjack new team here at Jemmy. It's a legit and going concern. So thank you to you all. Also, Will Boucher will continue on in his role as Jemmy's chief archivist and media consultant. And we have also welcomed Karen Young, who was my driver at the time. She's a wildly talented organizational maven and overall force for good. She will be our new office manager. So together, Maya and Jeff, along with our evolving board of advisors, are here to hold me and the rest of our team accountable as we endeavor to meet the demands of various timely projects that are currently in development within our organization. The most important and pressing of these is a complex research undertaking that requires the digitization of John's archives to be completed as swiftly as possible. And while Jemmy is actively fundraising to facilitate that project, we are also currently partnering with Jeff and Amanda and Rice University's grant writing team to apply for an NEH development grant on behalf of a metadata study that Jemmy and Archives of the Impossible would like to begin as soon as possible, with 4 discrete collections of experiencer-related files within John's archives. As many of you know, the experiencer community has long been derided for its inability to produce empirical proof of individual contact encounters. However, most mainstream researchers and academics aren't aware that credible researchers from all around the globe have been incubating a large trove of observational and intersubjective data that holds within it a detailed accounting of the that's a big word for me, the very epistemologically challenging reports of what used to be known as alien abductions. This meta-research initiative we're proposing will utilize human resources, AI, and methodologically rigorous protocols to capture the latent information contained within the files. The necessity of this endeavor cannot be overstated. Without it, it matters not how persuasive, compelling, or credible individual experiencers are in relating stories of phenomena that are simply too implausible for most people to accept at face value. In the past number of decades, it's become abundantly clear that independent experiencer narratives on their own lack the power to meaningfully impact centuries of human attachment to the Newtonian Cartesian worldview, a paradigm that has proven reliably unsusceptible to the high strangeness of contact. Bearing that in mind, we recognize that if we are asking the gatekeepers of human knowledge to seriously consider a new model of the cosmos that accommodates events so anomalous they require humankind to modify our understanding of reality, an extraordinary effort to provide at least some measure of proof for the existence of such things is appropriate. This project, known within GEMI as the Experiencer Disclosure Initiative, will, in partnership with Archives of the Impossible, endeavor to do just that under the guidance and supervision of a committee of elite academic advisors. It is our intention to mine the data, perform statistical analysis on the results, and submit white papers to science and academia for further debate in science and academia's contemporary dialectic about the contact phenomenon. To that end, we are currently raising funds for everything we will need to carry out this ambitious project. So if anyone here today or in our remote audience feels moved to financially contribute to this important work, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, Jeff, or Maya Cristobal. These funds will in large part go toward paying the salaries of GEMI's team, of mature professionals who have been for months and years volunteering their time in the faith that GEMI will soon be able to secure funding from allies who resonate with the critical importance of completing this research. As much as GEMI's team members would volunteer their time indefinitely if we could, the needs of Maslow's lowest rung demand satisfaction and a paycheck. So again, if any of you have been wondering how you might help the cause, we have some very prosaic needs that could be met through your support right now. For those interested, your donations are tax deductible as GEMI is an active 501c3. So as I move in the direction of trying to wrap up here, I'll do my best to address a few of the questions that I know are on people's minds regarding the contents of John's archives and when they will be made available to the public. Out of everything I've shared with you so far here today, this might be the bit that makes me the most nervous, because I'm aware of just how important John's files are to the general public and a large, very interested community of researchers, academics, students, skeptics, writers, and filmmakers. I know there are a lot of people who want to jump into them as if they were the deep end of a Narnia-esque swimming pool, hiding a system of subterranean caves that harbor previously untold secrets about the abduction phenomenon and the people who sought John's help as they struggled to metabolize the ontological shock of their contact encounters. For me personally, as one of the individuals who participated in John's research, and as someone who has experienced numerous abduction encounters and all manner of high strangeness and psi phenomena that accompanies them, I can tell you, no one is more committed and impassioned about surfacing the details and statistics of the phenomenon than that we know are lying latent within John's research materials. I want to get this information out and into the public domain as soon as possible. And I know that I am in good company with lots of other experiencers who want the truth to be known as well. Not just for a sense of validation, we do want to be taken seriously, but because we grok how important the data within our narratives is to science and academia's efforts to understand what our anomalous experiences infer about physics, space-time, and the foundational relationship between consciousness and reality. That being said, every file in the archives related to John's experiencers represents a person whose life, privacy, identity, and story are to be protected in every way. Period. Period. We will not betray the trust that experiencers place with John and everyone else who supported his work at the Program for Extraordinary Experiences Research. Protecting the anonymity of every single experiencer is of the utmost importance to me, Jeff, Amanda, Maya, and the rest of Jemmy's team. Indeed, it is our #1 priority. Immediately after which is our interest in facilitating and contributing to the methodologically rigorous research I mentioned before. In order to satisfy both of these prime directives, Jemmy must first complete the anonymization of a very large trove of files. Once we've done that, we'll have finished the first step of a complex and costly multiphasic process. Phase 2 will include scraping and aggregating the data for statistical analysis. The white papers will be written in Phase 3 and then made immediately available to the public on our Jemmy website after submission to the gatekeepers of human knowledge for consideration and further debate. We expect the full cycle to take us anywhere from 3 to 5 years. Obviously, the more quickly we receive the funding we need to complete this work, the more expediently we will be able to make the data available to the public. For those who have been champing at the bit to gain access to the experiencer-related materials, I'm sorry, really, truly I am, but you'll have to be patient for just a bit longer. As frustrating as that might be, I hope you can agree with me that doing this the right way is the right thing to do. I would also like to point out that even if anonymization wasn't the issue that it is for us, there is no feasible way for a researcher to show up at Rice for a week and dip a toe into these files. There are easily 100+ boxes full of documents that would be of interest. As a friendly reminder, each of these boxes contains anywhere from 500 to 2,000 pages each. In order to extrapolate any real meaning or value from these documents, again, as previously mentioned, a very well-funded project is going to need years, plenty of human resources, and AI to accomplish the task. Now, having said that, once the initial digitization of John's archives is complete and Amanda has had the opportunity to process the materials into Rice archives, the public will have access to all of the materials that span the breadth and scope of John's entire professional career. To clarify, the collection will exclude the aforementioned experiencer-related documents, as well as John's patient files from the Cambridge Hospital Department of Psychiatry, which have been placed on a 50-year hold to protect patient confidentiality. For those interested in knowing who John was beyond his work on the phenomenon, even just a brief glimpse into his archives will reveal that the man who was nothing if not prolific. The amount of original thinking, writing, and work that he created over the course of his lifetime is mind-boggling. It's almost incomprehensible. It's no wonder he was tired. His exceptional intelligence, warmth, compassion, and great care for the well-being of humankind and the planet we call home leaps off the pages at every turn. Now, that doesn't mean John was perfect, or that he never made mistakes, or that he didn't piss anyone off. He wasn't, and he did. Like all the rest of us, he was human. He was sometimes insecure and afraid, often quietly sad, and he struggled with intimate relationship challenges throughout his adult life. Having lost his biological mother at too young an age, when neural pathways of attachment and bonding are just forming, in many ways makes sense of John's chironic pain, an existential angst that sadly never fully resolved before his death. To me, knowing these things about him doesn't make him less of a cultural icon. It makes him a whole person who actualized his life to the best of his ability, given the gifts, talents, privilege, and pain he was born into. To learn all of these things and more about John, you'll be able to find in his archives, and I'm going to take a swig here because there's a list. Research and interviews on behalf of the numerous books and essays he authored, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography on T.E. Lawrence, materials related to his psychiatric work, files related to the 4 iterations of his nonprofit organization, research and writings about the threat of nuclear war and the impact it was having on the collective human psyche. For instance, he wrote a manuscript that never came to fruition, which he turned into a number of essays. There's also an interview with Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. There's correspondence with notable luminaries, politicians, and colleagues, materials related to travel, conferences, and workshops, his reflections on the evolution of human consciousness, including his interest in Grof breathwork, Est, Werner Erhard, and Esselin. There is also a very modest amount of personal materials regarding contemplations of life, love, and relationships, though I can tell you, you won't find any salacious material there. John was apparently very discerning about what he kept on file regarding his personal relationships. He did have some journals containing personal thoughts about all manner of things related to his life that are in his very hard-to-read doctoral scrawl. However, the Mack family is holding on to them for now until they have made a formal decision on the best time to donate them. The archives will also include, taking another breath here, the detailed police and coroner's reports from the event, the fateful event that ended John's life, along with other documents regarding the trial of Raymond Czesławski, who ultimately served jail time for his role in John's death. And let me just take a moment here to once again assert, because the conspiracy theories continue to circulate, John was not murdered, and that it's true the Mack family asked for leniency on behalf of Raymond, just as John would have wanted. His death was an accident in the purest sense of the term. He was a jet-lagged American in London, exhausted after a long day of public engagement and a lifetime of incessant, ambitious work. He was an American who apparently looked the wrong way when he stepped into a London intersection. This, of course, much to the dismay of Mr. Czesławski and many, many people all around the world who recognized in John a profoundly inspired and brilliant mind whose intellectual beauty was eclipsed perhaps only by his kind and poetic soul. Almost there, hang in with me. The experiencer community remembers John for his work related to the phenomenon, but he had a huge and remarkable life before it, as well as a long history of advocating for those who couldn't do so for themselves, even when he raised the establishment's ire in taking a stand on their behalf. Everything John did in his life leading up to his introduction to the phenomenon uniquely prepared him for the work that has, in his death, become a legacy to all of humankind. When John, see ya? I like that just happened. That's a good sign. When John traveled to speak about the phenomenon, he would often ask one or two experiencers to accompany him on stage. He did this in order to give us the opportunity to express in our own words the profound impact the contact encounters had on our lives and worldview. I would like to invoke his presence here today and honor him in kind by ending with the close of his unpublished manuscript, When Worldviews Collide. This is a project that Jeff Kripal has agreed to help us complete with a foreword by John's longtime friend and colleague, philosophy professor Michael Zimmerman. In short, John concludes in his manuscript that to some meaningful extent, the phenomenon is not about aliens. It's about us, and I happen to agree. He also makes the case for an emergent worldview wherein humankind is moving away from the separatism and isolation that seems intrinsic to the materialist paradigm. He titled the final section of his manuscript, "Where Could We Be Going?" He begins. With a bit of irony, perhaps, writer Daniel Quinn said to an audience at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, "I can tell you with complete confidence that something extraordinary is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 decades. The people of our culture are going to figure out how to live sustainably, or they're not. Philanthropist Theodore Malin states the choice more explicitly. Are we going to continue the pattern of living and giving from fear and greed, guilt or shame, or are we going to move on to a higher level of consciousness? I resonated with these words because they carry the power of uncertainty and the freedom to choose. People often look to those in authority for answers, yet if there is one force that afflicts us most in this time of history, it seems to be our attraction to leaders who exhort their followers with words that convey absolute certainty and little, if any, evidence of self-reflection. But it seems to me that we have had enough of exhortation and hear too few voices now that are unsure about nothing except the power of truth and love. The time we seem to be moving into now might be called the age of consciousness. Consciousness has two fundamental meanings that are rather different, though related. On the one hand, it refers to an emerging cosmology in which the universe is understood as a vast creative intelligence, akin to what has usually been called God. It gives rise to matter and energy, which are expressions of its power. But consciousness also refers to our capacity for awareness and self-knowledge. These two meanings come together when, in the process of developing deepening awareness, one comes to the realization that ourselves, that which is doing the knowing, is part of consciousness in the first sense, inseparable from the infinite or the everything that many think of as God. Awareness and coming to grips with fear lie at the heart of the work of psychotherapists. But in the larger world, we assign to flawed leaders the job of assuaging our anxieties or bringing security through aggressive approaches to threatening problems that are dubious at best and may be incalculably dangerous. In the wake of the attacks of September 11, 2001, there were voices that urged us to go beyond hyperbolic denunciations and warring upon the evil other, and to consider our own part in bringing upon us these tragic events. Writer Barbara Kingsolver observed that our country lacked the ability to know how to deal with hurt. There are 100 ways to be a good citizen, she said, and one of them is to look finely at the things we don't want to see. Jane Goodall, in receiving a Global Citizen Award for her work as a leader in promoting peace and environmental awareness, said that because the world has gone really crazy, she felt compelled to take on a role in changing consciousness that she would not formally have accepted. It is not surprising, perhaps, that so many of the voices of understanding are now those of women. We are surrounded now by the wonders of our masculine consciousness, and such wonders are not to be despised, writes Llewellyn Vaughan-Lee, a London-born author who embraced the Sufi tradition. But they have been bought at a price. In our fascination with the world of science and its tangible results, we have starved and neglected the inner feminine world. Everything else is secondary, it seems to me, to the transformation of consciousness, the spiritual revolution that is spreading slowly but inexorably around the world. For as this awakening takes hold, we will no longer tolerate political, economic, and educational systems that divide and separate us from one another and serve mainly elite groups intent on maintaining their wealth and power at the expense of most other people and the life of the planet itself. Sufi master Pierre Villiot invites us to become knights of awakening and replace the weapons of destruction with lances of light that dispel the darkness. It is time for us to recognize that the opening of heart and the heart's knowing, which is a central theme of this book, can lead to the awareness of our interdependence and the emergence of a worldwide sense of community that will transcend the sectarian and nationalistic focus on competition and narrowly defined interests. Our freedom, writes Ralph Wood, lies in becoming communal selves who freely embrace our moral, religious, and political obligations. There is no mythical, free, and autonomous self that exists apart from these ties. And John continues, I have been taking part in a project in which great thinkers in the understanding of consciousness have been asked to imagine how our lives would be different if we came to recognize the primacy of this creative intelligence. Professor Saeed Hossein Nasir's response captures the vision of my book. We would no longer feel as aliens in a dead and forbidding cosmos, as accidents in a lifeless universe. Far from being aliens, we would once again feel at home in the cosmos, as did traditional men and women over the ages. Our rapport with animals, plants, and even the inanimate world would change from one of strife and need for control and domination to one of harmony and equilibrium, with a much greater possibility for intimacy between human beings than the current mindset makes possible. 2 weeks before his death from a brain tumor, a 16-year-old boy wrote a poem to all of us. I ask you, reader, whoever you may be, take my trembling hand and warm it with care and sympathy. Time brings a changed mood and heals wonderfully. As I sit here, I am not at all lost. Love is coming, help is coming. I will be taken care of. I will return to the womb of security. I believe that love is the sole purpose of a man's life. And John finishes, I hope that the dying, which brings about the transformations that are the concerns of this book, will not require the literal deaths of countless people. This is and should be the dying of a worldview from which new ways of thinking and being can emerge. And for me, I believe, as I know many of you do as well, that we are on the verge of the next Copernican revolution. Personally, I love that the DNA of John's research and life will be inextricably linked to this quantum leap in Homo sapiens evolution. In the spirit of John's trailblazing, it is my hope that we will find the courage and funding to carry on his work, and in so doing, help facilitate humankind's transition into a new age of consciousness, wherein the human heart and mind achieve the coherence needed to perceive an expression of reality, intelligence, and love greater than we ever imagined could exist beyond the veil of our material world. Thanks. Thank you. You were a very patient, audience. That was a lot. Thanks for listening. While I'm wiping the snot from my nose, I would want to, I'll share with you a few pictures of our adventure, and then we'll move over to the panel, and we'll, Amanda's going to share some thoughts from her side about the archives, and then we'll open it up for questions. So that is my home in Norway. That's right over our house, and that is what I left to come do this work. That's our front yard, and this is called the Blue Hour in Norway. Neither of these pictures have had any filter placed onto them. This is what it looks like. So being here, I have to say, feels like being on a different earth. It's just the most beautiful part of life and God and land that Earth has to offer. I very much enjoyed living there, and it was very challenging to walk away from it. This is as we landed in Massachusetts, Beverly, Mass. This is Mark Curate standing there looking out into the bay. That is the last time Mark saw any of nature for a number of months, because this was what it looked like the rest of the time. So Mark was responsible for our tech support. He got all of the tech set up for us and helped oversee things all along the way. This is what a single box looks like. This is in the scanning process. This is after staples have been removed. The documents are back and forth, so we can keep them discreet. This is the crew, the core crew. A number of these individuals came back multiple times to keep helping as the timeline got extended. That's Brian off to the left. Karin, whose back is toward us. She's our new office manager. There's Heather off to the right, and I have this thing. Anne, sorry, all those three women came in at once, and all of their names are interchangeable in my mind, so we just started calling them Borg. So Anne, sitting in the back there, was a human resources monster in the best way possible. She just kept sourcing people to help us out and keep the project going. Their DNA is all in this in the best way. This is what John's archives look like. It is, as we say, an enormous undertaking. But you can see that all of the files, all the boxes are very clearly marked, and the materials inside of them reconcile with what the fronts of the boxes say. So as one important link in the chain of custody of John's archives, I can tell you that everything is intact as we pulled it from his house. So that, by the way, was what it looked like leaving Boston, and this was what happened 5 days later. And then this is where the boxes are in the Woodson, do I have it right? In the Woodson Center, and under Amanda's watchful eye to make sure that they're looked after. So, Amanda, we're getting to the place where you probably want to start talking about some of this. Here is just an example. You can see to the left, like one simple article that gets pulled out, and everything's in differing sizes and shapes, and so it's just a very, very tedious, meticulous process. We also have tapes of John's interviews for the aerial phenomenon. Everything, all of the tapes, all media has been digitized by Will. So we have a backup, or we have a copy of everything that will ultimately be available to the public. And of course, the man himself. And on that note, I'm going to exhale and order my margarita. Thanks a lot.
That's great.
Okay, I'm glad that you did a transition and went through those slides, because I wasn't sure how I was going to follow that story with talking about the nature of archives. So my name's Amanda Focke, and I'm the head of special collections in the Fondren Library here at Rice. It's also known as the Woodson Research Center. And I have been there in the archives for about 20 years. And I have to say, this period of the past 6 years or so, where the archives of the impossible have come in, and has been a really, truly amazing and very special time in my career. The reason I'm interested in doing this kind of work is supporting research and kind of making order out of chaos. And so to do that with this kind of material is really a challenge and an honor. It's very exciting. And so it's a pleasure working with all of these people up here and many more, and many of you who are in this room who also work on the collections here. I don't want to go on too long, because I know you probably have questions, but I thought I would cover some basics that a number of you might be interested in knowing. We are open to the public. Rice is a private university, but our library is open to the public. No one needs an appointment to just come into the library in particular, but you do kind of need an appointment to come look at the archives of the impossible in our department. We're on the first floor of the library. We're open to anyone, but a lot of our collections are stored off-site. You saw the picture of John Mack's many, many boxes. So we have about 2,000 archival collections in special collections, and the archives of the impossible are 15 of them. So I put my other glasses on so I can read. So together, the archives of the impossible represent about 600 linear feet of boxes. And one of those boxes that you saw in Karin's picture is about a foot wide. So 600 linear feet of materials, and currently several terabytes of original born digital data that we take care of, to be followed by more terabytes of digitized content. So it sounds like it might be a small portion of our overall collections, but it is significant in size, and we're very, very excited about the grant proposal that we're writing in order to increase the access to the Mack collection. That's going to be very challenging. It sounds Karin was saying, oh, it sounds like it might be easy just to scan a bunch of documents. Well, once you scan them and you have text recognized from them, which is its own challenge, then anonymization of data and getting them to people in an ethical manner, it's complicated. But we really have such a great village of thinkers and people with the hearts who want to see this happen that it will. It just is going to take a little bit of time, which may seem frustrating, but you can consider how long it sat in a warehouse kind of storage space waiting for its moment. The moment has come. We're working on it. So that is very good news. You may be interested in what other kinds of archives of the impossible are there. And I won't go through a list so that we have time for questions, but outside there's this flyer that has a QR code that's the link to the research guide online, so where you can go and see what all the collections are. And this link is also already and has been for a good while on the impossiblearchives.rice.edu website. So it's out there. When we as archivists write guides to the archival collections so that researchers such as yourselves know that they exist and how you can come and use them. So for the 15 collections that we have in this area, the ones that are processed and we have guides for them, you can click and read the guide to the collection and get a feel for which collections are of interest to you, and down to specifically which boxes would you like to come and use. So when you make an appointment to come to the library and use the materials in person, you would be able to say which collection and which box numbers you want to work with. And if you don't, then we'll help you figure that out. We also do distance reference for people who aren't able to travel to do their work on site with us. So that is exciting. Let's see. I think I have said a lot of the things that I wanted to say, and I want to make sure there's time for questions. Anna Shparberg is Humanities librarian and is my partner in crime in terms of dealing with books and journals that are in the general circulating stacks.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And it's as the subject librarian to the Department of Religion, it has been my honor and privilege to work with Jeff and with you for the last 6 years in assembling materials on the paranormal. And I come in from the side of books and serials, periodicals, journals. Frequently, we receive, in addition to archival materials, we receive gifts of books, many of them carefully curated, many first editions, and unique materials which libraries do not often collect. At this moment, we're finishing the processing of the book collection of Larry Bryant, who some of you may have heard of. He lived in Washington, D.C., and he worked at the Pentagon. And Larry donated us, upon his passing, hundreds, probably well over 1,000 copies of unique and remarkable books on the paranormal, his collection. And we're right now working on adding it, on cataloging it and adding it to our collection so it can be used, which it can be used by researchers such as yourselves, which makes us, I think, in the United States, the premier library for that has that kind of material. But of course, the books are important, but they're only the supporting materials. So I could say secondary sources to the primary sources, which are housed at the archives. And I can tell you, I have been watching us acquire, receive gifts of precious collections, beginning with the Jacques Vallée gift. And there was mention, just a vague idea, after we accepted the collections of Jacques Vallée and Whitley Strieber and Richard Haynes and all the other ones. And then from time to time, Jeff would mention the name John E. Mack. And it sounded very hopeful but unlikely. I would say, in the, and suddenly, you know, just like a thunderbolt several months ago, I heard that it was really happening. Actually, it had happened. The materials were already on their way here, and I just cannot describe my feelings, you know, at this incredible acquisitions, and I can only thank Karin for the tremendous work you have done. And I just wanted to tell that it is our honor, our pleasure, and we will try to live up to expectations.
You already have, and then some.
Yes, yes, so we will do our best, and thank you so much for placing this trust in us.
Of course. Thank
you.
you. Thank you.